What's up, my boys? What's up? Here I am back. Let me drink a water sip. Chapter 5. Of course, She must buy the tea in Uncle Benjamin's grocery store. To buy it anywhere else was unthinkable. Yet, whereas he hated to go to Uncle Benjamin's store on her 29th birthday, there was no hope that he would not remember it. Why? Demanded Uncle Benjamin, leeringly, as he tied up her tea. Our young ladies like their grammarians. Well and see, with Uncle Benjamin's, well, in the background of her mind, said meekly, I don't know. Why? Because, chuckled Uncle Benjamin, they can decline matrimony. The two clerks, Joy Hammer and Claude Bertram, chuckled also, and Valency disliked them a little more than ever. On the first day, Claude Bertram had seen her in the store. She had heard him whisper to Joy, Who's that? And Joy had said, Valency Stolen, one of the dear old maids, curable or incurable. Claude had asked with a snicker, evidently thinking the question very clever. Wallace smarted and knew the stink of that old recollection. 29, Uncle Benjamin was saying, Dear me, Das, you're dangerously near the second corner and not even thinking of getting married yet. 29, it seems impossible. Then Uncle Benjamin said an original thing. Uncle Benjamin said, How time does fly. I think it cross, said Valency passionately. Passion was so alien to Uncle Benjamin's conception of Valency that he didn't know what to make of her. To cover his confusion, he asked another conundrum as he tied up her beans. Cousin Stickles had remembered at the last moment that they must have beans. Beans were cheap and filling. What two ages are apt to prove illusory? Asked Uncle Benjamin. And not waiting for Valency to give it up, he added, Mirage and marriage. Mirage is pronounced as mirage, said Valency shortly, picking up her tea and her beans. For the moment, she did not care whether Uncle Benjamin cut her out of his will or not. She walked out of the store while Uncle Benjamin stared after her with his mouth open. Then he shook his head. By the way, in the meantime, the weather is absolutely brilliant. Poor Dawes is taking it hard, he said. Williams was sorry by the time she reached the next crossing. Why had she lost her patience like that? Uncle Benjamin would be annoyed and would likely tell her mother that had been impatient to me, and her mother would lecture her for a week. I've held my tongue for 20 years, thought Wallace. Why couldn't I have held it once more? Yes, it was just 20. Wallace reflected. Since she had first been twitted with her loverless condition, She remembered the bitter moment perfectly. She was just 9 years old, and she was standing alone on the school playground while the other little girls of her class were playing a game in which you must be chosen by a boy as his partner before you could play. Nobody had chosen Wallace. Little, pale, black haired Wallace, with her prim, long sleeved apron and odd, slanted eyes. Oh, said a pretty girl to her. I'm so sorry for you. You ain't got a bill. You ain't got a ball. Ugh. Well, as he had said defiantly, as she continued to say for 20 years, I don't want a ball. But this afternoon, well, as he once and for all stopped saying that. Ugh. I'm gonna be honest with myself anyhow, she thought savagely. Uncle Benjamin's riddles hurt me because they are true. I don't want to be married. I want a house of my own. I want a husband of my own. I want sweet little fat babies of my own. Willis stopped suddenly, aghast at her own recklessness. She felt sure that Rev. Dr. Stalin, who passed her at this moment, read her thoughts and disapproved of them thoroughly. Willis was afraid of Dr. Stalin, had been afraid of him ever since the Sunday. 23 years before, when he had first come to St. Albans, Wells had been too late for Sunday school that day, and she had gone into the church timidly and sat in their pew. No one else was in the church. Nobody except the new rector, Dr. Starling. Dr. Starling stood up in front of the church door, beckoned to her, and said sternly, Hey, little boy, come up here. Valencia had stared around her. There was no little boy. There was no one in all the huge church but herself. The strange man with the blue glasses couldn't mean her. She was not a boy. She was not a boy. Little boy, repeated Dr. Stalin, more strongly still. Shaking his forefinger fiercely at her. Hey, come up here at once. Valencia arose as if hypnotized and walked up the aisle. Easy, easy. She was too terrified to do anything else. What dreadful thing was going to happen to her? What had happened to her? Had she actually turned into a boy? She came to stop in front of Dr. Stalling. Dr. Stalling shook his forefinger, such a long, knuckly forefinger at her, and said, Little boy, take off your hat. Well, as she took off her hat, she had a scrawny little pigtail hanging down her back. But Dr. Stalling was short sighted and did not perceive it. Little boy, go back to the seat and always take off your hat in the church. Remember. Well, as she went back to her seat, carrying her hat like an automaton, presently her mother came in. Das, said Mrs. Stalling, what do you mean by taking off your hat? Put it on instantly. Well, and she put it on instantly. She was cold with her fear lest Dr. Stalling should immediately summon her up front again. She would have to go, of course. It never occurred to her that one could disobey the rector, and the church was full of people now. Oh, what would she do if that horrible, Stabbing forefinger was shaken at her again for all those people. Valence sat through the whole service in an agony of dread and was sick for a week afterwards. Nobody knew why. Mrs. Frederick again bemoaned herself of her delicate child. Dr. Stalling found out his mistake and laughed over it to Valence, who did not laugh. She never got over her dread of Dr. Stalling, and now to be caught by him on the street corner, thinking such things. Valence got her John Foster's book, Magic of Wings, his latest, all about birds, said Miss Clarkson. She had almost decided that she would go home. Instead of going to see Dr. Trent, her courage had failed her. She was afraid of offending Uncle James, afraid of angering her mother, afraid of facing Graf. Shaggy brought old Dr. Trent, who could probably tell her, as he had told Cousin Gladys, that her trouble was entirely imaginary, and that she only had it because she liked to have it. No, she wouldn't go. She would get a bottle of Redfern's purple pills instead. Redfern's purple pills were the standard medicine of the Starling clan. Had they not cured second cousin Geraldine when five doctors had given her up? Valency always felt very skeptical concerning the virtues of the purple pills, but there might be something in them, and it was easier to take them than to face Dr. Trent alone. She would glance over the magazines in the reading room for a few minutes and then go home. Valency tried to read a story, but it made her furious. On every page was a picture of the heroine surrounded by adoring men. And here was she, Valency Stalling, who could not get a solitary book. Valency slammed the magazine shut. She opened Magic of Wings. Her eyes fell on the paragraph that changed her life. Fear is the original sin, wrote John Foster. Almost all the evil in the world has its origin in the fact that someone is afraid of something. It is a cold, slimy serpent coiling about you. It is horrible to live with fear, and it is of all things degrading. Well, she shut magical things and stood up. She would go to see Dr. Trent. Now, chapter number 6. The audio was not so dreadful. After all, Dr. Trent was as gruff and abrupt as usual, but he did not tell her her ailment was imaginary. After he had listened to her symptoms and asked a few questions and made a quick examination, he sat for a moment looking at her quite intently. Whereas I thought he looked as if he were sorry for her. She caught her breath for a moment. Was the trouble serious? Ah, it couldn't be. Surely, it really hadn't bothered her much. Only lately it had got a little worse. Dr. Trent opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the telephone at his elbow rang sharply. He picked up the receiver. Valency, watching him, saw his face change suddenly as he listened. Hello, yes, yes. What? Yes, yes, a brief interval. My God. Dr. Trent dropped the receiver, dashed out of the room, and upstairs without even a glance at Valency. She heard him rushing madly about overhead, barking out a few remarks to somebody, presumably his housekeeper. Then he came tearing downstairs with a cloth bag in his hands, snatched his hat and coat from the rack, jumped open the street door, and rushed down the street in the direction of the station. Valency sat alone in the little office, feeling more absolutely foolish than she ever had felt before in her life. Foolish and humiliated. So this was all that had come of her heroic determination to live up to John Foster and cast fear aside. Not only was she a failure as a relative and non-existent as a sweetheart or friend, but she was not even of any importance as a patient. Dr. Trent had forgotten her very presence in his excitement over whatever message had come by the telephone. She had gained nothing by ignoring Uncle James and flying in the face of family tradition. For a moment, she was afraid she was gonna cry. It was also ridiculous. Then she heard Dr. Trent's housekeeper coming down the stairs. Valency rose and went to the office door. The doctor forgot all about me, she said with a twisted smile. Well, that's too bad, said Mrs. Patterson sympathetically. But it wasn't much wonder, poor man. There was a telegram phoned over from the port. Grey clouds, gloomy sky, over sky. Love it. Absolutely love it. Well, that's too bad, said Mrs. Patterson sympathetically. But it wasn't much wonder, poor man. There was a telegram. They phoned over from the academy, over from the port. His son has been terribly injured in an auto accident in Montreal. The doctor had just 10 minutes to catch the train. I don't know what he'll do if anything happens to Ned. He's just bound up in the boy. You'll have to come again, Miss Starling. I hope it's nothing serious. Oh, no, nothing serious, agreed Williamson. She felt a little less humiliated. It was no wonder poor Dr. Trent had forgotten her at such a moment. Nevertheless, she felt very flat and discouraged as she went down the street. Well, as she went home by the shortcut of Lover's Lane, she did not often go through Lover's Lane, but it was getting near supper time. And it would never do to be late. Lover's Lane would back of the village, one back of the village, under great elms and maples, and deserved its name. It was hard to go there at any time and not find some canoodling couple or young girls in pairs, arms intertwined, honestly talking over their little secrets. Well, she didn't know, which made her feel more self-conscious and uncomfortable. This evening, she encountered both. She met Connie Hale and Kate Bailey in new pink organdy dresses with flowers stuck quaintly in their glossy, bare hair. Valency had never had a pink dress or wore flowers in her hair. Then she passed a young couple she didn't know, tendering along, obvious to everything but themselves. The young man's arm was around the girl's waist quite shamelessly. Valencia never walked with a man's arm about her. She felt that she ought to be shocked. They might leave that sort of thing for the screening twilight, please. But she wasn't shocked. In another flash of desperate, stark honesty, she owned to herself that she was merely envious. When she passed them, she felt quite sure they were laughing at her, petting her. There's that queer little old maid. Well, is taller. They say she never had a beau in her whole life. Valency fairly ran to get out of Lover's Lane. Never had she felt so utterly colorless and skinny and insignificant. Just where Lover's Lane debouched on the street, an old car was parked. Valency knew that car well, by sound at least, and everybody in Deerwood knew it. This was before the phrase tin lizard had come into circulation in Deerwood, at least. But if it had been known, this car was the tiniest of lizards. Though it was not a Ford, but an old grey Slauson, nothing more battered and disreputable could be imagined. It was Barney Snape's car, and Barney himself was just scrambling up from under it. Barney, in overalls plastered with mud. Valency gave him a swift, furtive look as she hurried by. This was only the second time she had ever seen the notorious Barney Smith, though she had heard enough about him in the 5 years that he had been living up back in Muskova. The first time had been nearly a year ago, on the Muskogee Road. He had been crawling out from under his car then too, and he had given her a cheerful grin as she went by, a little whimsical grin that gave him the look of an amused gnome. He didn't look bad. She didn't believe he was bad. In spite of the wild eons that were always being told of him. Of course, he went tearing in that terrible old race Lawson through daylight hours when all decent people were in bed, often with old roaring Abel, who made the night hideous with his howls. Both of them dead drunk, my dear, and everyone knew that he was an escaped convict and a defaulting bank clerk and a murderer in hiding and an infidel and an illegitimate son of an old roaring Abel gay and the father of roaring Abel's illegitimate grandchild and a counterfeiter and a forger and a few other awful things. But still, Wallace did not believe he was bad. Nobody with a smile like that could be bad, no matter what he had done. It was that night the prince of the Blue Castle changed from being from a grim Joe and hair with a dead premature gray to a rakish individual with overlong, tawny hair, dashed with red, dark brown eyes, and ears that struck out just enough to give him an alert look, but not enough to be called flying jibs. but he still retained something a little grim about the jaw. Barney's snake looked even more disreputable than usual just now. It was very evident that he hadn't shaved for days, and his hands and arms, bare to the shoulders, were black with grease. But he was whistling gleefully to himself, and he seemed so happy that Valency envied him. She envied him his light-heartedness and his irresponsibility and his mysterious little cabin on an island in Lake Taurus. Even his raggedy old grey Slauson. Neither he nor his car had to be respectable and live up to traditions. When he rattled past her a few minutes later, bareheaded, leaning back in his lazy at a ravish angle, his longish hair blowing in the wind, a villainous looking old black pipe in his mouth, she envied him again. Man had the best of it, no doubt about it. This outlaw was happy. Whatever he was or wasn't, she. Where's the fucking smell coming up? She, Valence Sterling, respectable, well behaved to the last degree, was unhappy and had always been unhappy. So there you are. Bro, I'm getting a smell of something burning engine. Valence was just in time for supper. The sun had clouded over, and a dismal, drizzling rain was falling again. Cousin Strickles had the neuralgia. Valency had to do the family dawning, and there was no time for magical wings. Can the dawning wait until tomorrow? She pleaded. Tomorrow will bring its own duties, said Mrs. Frederick inexorably. Valency dawned all the evening and listened to Mrs. Frederick and cousin Stickles talking the eternal, nagging gossip of the clan as they knitted drearily at interminable black stockings. They discussed second cousin Lillian's approaching wedding in all its bearings. On the whole, they approved. Second cousin Lillian was doing well for herself, though she hasn't hurried, said cousin Stickles. She must be 25. There have not, fortunately, been many old maids in our connection, said Mrs. Frederick bitterly. Valency flinched. She had run the darning nail into her finger. Third cousin, our own grave, had been scratched by a cat and had blood poisoning in his finger. Cats are most dangerous animals, said Mrs. Frederick. I would never have a cat about the house. She glared significantly at Valency through her terrible glasses. Once, 5 years ago, Valency had asked if she might have a cat. She had never referred to it since, but Mrs. Frederick still suspected her of harboring the unlawful desire in her heart of hearts. Once Valency sneezed. Now, in this tolling coat, it was very bad form to sneeze in public. You can always repress a sneeze by pressing your finger on your upper lip, said Mrs. Frederick rebukingly. Half past 9 o'clock, and so a Mr. Pappas would say, Shabbat. But first, cousin Stickles' neuralgic back must be rubbed with red forms liniment. Valency did that. Well, she always had to do it. She hated the smell of Redford's linen. She hated the smart, beaming, portly, bewhiskered, bespectacled picture of Dr. Redford on the bottom. Her fingers smelled of the horrible stuff after she got into bed. In spite of all the scrubbing she gave them, Wednesday's day of destiny had come and had gone. She added it as she had begun it in text. Okay, it ended exactly 30 minutes later. I would like to live here